Colonel Marek Sorin never raised his voice. He had learned long ago that men who shout are men who are still trying to convince themselves. And Sorin had stopped needing convincing somewhere around his second war. So when he stood at the head of the column, with the wind, cutting sideways across the valley, and told his signals officer to inform the battalion that the ridge would be theirs by nightfall, he said it the way another man might mention the weather. He lowered his field glasses, brushed the frost from the shoulder of his greatcoat, and looked up the broken switchback road toward the small observation post pinned against the saddle of the mountain. Through the glass he had counted 9 figures, one generator exhaust trickling a thread of gray into the white sky, and a single supply track now buried under 2 days of snow. 9 tired people and no road home. He keyed his radio and told the lead vehicle to advance. 31 armored carriers began to roll, treads packing the snow into glass, and not one of the men inside them noticed the woman already lying flat across the roof of the water, shed 1.5 kilometers above, motionless behind a rifle, breathing slow, deciding in what order they would stop being a threat. To understand how 9 soldiers came to be holding the Kestrel against an armored brigade, you have to understand that nobody had intended for them to be there at all. The observation post had been a relay station, nothing more. It sat at 3,000 meters on a shoulder of rock above the Vena Valley, a coalition listening point meant to be staffed by a rotating handful of technicians who watched a screen, logged movement, and went home after 90 days. It was never a fighting position. The walls were prefabricated panel, the kind that kept wind out and stopped exactly nothing else. There were 2 machine guns, both older than the youngest soldier operating them, and enough ammunition for a firefight that everyone had assumed would never come, because the valley had been quiet for 1.5 years. Then the ceasefire in the lowlands collapsed in a single afternoon. The lowland garrison pulled back to defend the river crossings, and the Kestrel found itself the only coalition presence on the eastern wall of a valley that Sorin's brigade now wanted for the road it controlled. Sergeant Theo Brandt had done the math on the first night, and he had kept doing it, because it was the kind of math that did not improve no matter how many times you ran it. He was 38, 11 years in, a career soldier from a mill town outside Thunder Bay, who had joined because the mill closed and stayed because he turned out to be good at the one thing the Army actually rewards, which is keeping frightened people calm long enough to do their jobs. He stood now in the cramped operations room with a cooling mug of instant coffee he had no intention of drinking, holding it because his hands needed something to do, and watched the thermal feed bloom with shapes that should not have been moving. 9 soldiers. 1 access road. No air support inside the storm. The nearest relief was a mechanized company 11 hours out by ground if the passes were open and the passes were not open. He had keyed all of this into the log in his small water-stained notebook, every count and every contact, and he had noticed 2 nights ago that he was running out of pages and had not started a second book. Some part of him, the part that had survived 2 tours by reading situations honestly, understood that he might not need one. The narrator will tell you plainly what Brandt only suspected, that a column of 31 armored vehicles against 9 lightly armed soldiers in fixed positions is not a battle. It is an arithmetic problem with a known answer. Armor does not need to be clever. It needs only to keep moving, absorb what little the defenders can throw, and arrive. The defender's single advantage, elevation, evaporates the moment the column gets close enough for direct fire. Brandt knew this. Every soldier in the room knew it without being told, the way you know the floor is below you. Which is why, when Corporal Nico Berdal asked from the doorway whether he should wake everyone, Brandt said yes, full kit, 15 minutes, every position manned. And then he added, after a pause that the room noticed, wake Hartley too. There was a particular quality to that pause, and it is worth slowing down to sit inside it, because it tells you something about how human beings sort one another. Sloane Hartley had arrived at the Kestrel 6 days before the storm closed the valley, on the last supply flight in. Her file was a quartermaster technician's file, clean and uninteresting. Stores, inventory, logistics, 4 years of service, 2 postings, nothing that asked a second look. She did her work without complaint, and she did it well. She also said almost nothing. In 6 days, Brant could count the full sentences he had heard her speak, and most of them were about ration counts and fuel logs. She took her meals at the end of the table, with her back near the wall and her eyes on the door, which the others noticed at first, and then stopped noticing, because the human mind is a machine for turning the strange into the ordinary as quickly as possible. She kept a long, hard case, maybe 130 centimeters, padlocked, stowed under her cot, and when Private Cassidy Locke had once asked what was in it, Hartley had said tools, and something in the flatness of the word had closed the question so completely that Locke never asked again. The unit had filed her under harmless. This is the central mechanism of the whole story, and the narrator wants you to hold it. People see what they expect to see, and an army runs on expectation. Soren's brigade was about to learn the cost of that the same way the Kestrel almost had. What none of them knew, what Brant himself would only piece together later and never fully confirm, was that the woman they had filed under harmless had spent 4 years doing a job that did not officially exist, in places that did not officially have soldiers, and that the name on her transfer papers was not the name she had been issued at birth or the name under which she had once been very, very good. That her last operation, a 2-person job in a country she could not name, had been logged as a failure. That her spotter had not come home from it. That she herself appeared in the system, if you knew how to look and you were not supposed to, as missing, presumed killed, 3 years gone. The army that signed her checks believed she was dead. There is a freedom in that, and there is a particular kind of loneliness, and Sloane Hartley carried both up onto the roof of the watershed in the gray light before the column moved, and lay down and began to read the wind. She read it the way a sailor reads water. The valley funneled air down from the high passes in a steady northwesterly that the storm kept shoving around, 12 to 14 kilometers an hour, with gusts that spiked higher and then dropped to nothing for a breath. She ranged the lead vehicle and the cluster of officers near it, and she did the calculation that her brain did faster than she could have written it. Distance, drop, drift, the small spin-induced sideways creep of a bullet over that much air, the half-second of flight in which the world would keep moving, and she would have to have already accounted for it. The lead group sat at a little over 3,500 meters. At that range, the round would be in the air for nearly 5 full seconds. 5 seconds is a long time. In 5 seconds, a man takes 2 steps. The shot she was setting up was not a shot at where Colonel Soren stood. It was a shot at where Colonel Soren would be standing when a piece of metal arrived from a mountain he had not thought to search. The narrator will be honest about something here, because the comments under stories like this one always ask, and the asking is fair. A shot like this is not magic, and it is not luck, and it is also not something most snipers in most armies can do. It sits at the far ragged edge of what is physically possible, and it depends on cold air being dense and predictable, on a target that holds still for the wrong half-second, on a shooter who has fired tens of thousands of rounds until the calculation is no longer thinking, but instinct. Hartley had that. She had earned it in a way that had cost her more than she would ever tell anyone. She let her breath out, found the lull between gusts, and let her finger complete a motion it had completed in worse conditions than this. The rifle pushed back into her shoulder, and 5 seconds later, 1.5 kilometers away, in front of 31 vehicles and 80 men who had been told this would be easy, Colonel Marek Soren folded down into the snow without a sound that anyone near him could connect to a cause. What happened next, down on the road, is the most important part of this entire account, and it has almost nothing to do with the bullet. A single death does not stop a column. What stops a column is what the death does to the minds of the living. Soren's officers heard no shot, because at that range the crack arrives long after the round, scattered and directionless off the rock walls. One moment the colonel was speaking, the next he was down, and there was no enemy, no muzzle flash, no direction to face. The human brain hates this more than it hates almost anything. It can manage a threat it can see. It cannot manage a threat that arrives from nowhere and takes the most senior man in the formation while he stands in the open giving orders. The narrator wants you to understand that fear is not the opposite of courage. Fear is information arriving faster than the mind can file it, and 80 men had just received, all at once, The single most disorienting piece of information a soldier can receive, that they were being watched and chosen, one at a time, by something they could not find. Up at the Kestrel, Brant was watching the thermal feed when the lead cluster of shapes scattered. He did not understand it. "What just happened?" he said, and Master Corporal Priya Anand, hunched over the signals console with her headset half on, said she had no idea the column had just stopped. It had genuinely stopped. 31 vehicles that had been rolling forward sat motionless on the switchback, and the small heat shapes of men were spilling out of formation, spreading laterally off the road into the deep snow, on both the flanks the way a trained force is supposed to when it takes precision fire from an unknown direction. It is the correct response. It is also, on a mountain road in a blizzard, almost useless, because lateral terrain is thigh-deep powder that turns a fast soldier into a slow one and from above paints every one of them brighter against the cold ground. Hartley watched them disperse and felt nothing in particular about it. She ranged the second knot of officers, the ones now crouching, and waited for the next half-second of stillness the wind would give her. She took the second one as a major named Devor Vasek was lifting a radio to call the rear vehicles forward. The narrator will name him because names matter, because somewhere Vasek had a mother who did not know yet, and because a story that turns men into numbers becomes the same kind of story it claims to be against. Vasek went down. The chain of command, which had run cleanly from Soren to Vasek, now had a second break in it in under 90 seconds. And the men below were beginning to do the thing that ends operations more reliably than any weapon, which is to stop believing that the people giving them orders could keep them alive. A captain named Illick took over by default, crouched in the hatch of his carrier with his head below the steel rim, and he made all the correct decisions. He ordered communications silence on the main frequency. He shifted to an encrypted secondary. He sent 4 men up toward the eastern ridgeline, the obvious high ground, the place a sniper would logically be. He was a competent officer doing everything right, and the narrator notes this with something close to sympathy because it changed nothing. The threat was not on the eastern ridgeline. It was 90 degrees off and 400 meters lower than anyone was looking, lying flat on a watershed that no one would think to check because no one shoots downhill from inside the very position they are trying to defend. Inside the Kestrel, Corporal Birdall said it first, the thing the whole room was thinking. "Sergeant, whoever's doing that, she's holding them." He was 23, from a reserve unit in Saskatchewan, and he had the kind of face that could not hide what it felt, and what it felt right now was a hope so sudden it frightened him. Brant said, "Don't celebrate," but even as he said it, he was running the math a different way than he had run it 10 minutes earlier. 10 minutes earlier, the math had been about how long they could delay an outcome that was fixed. Now the variable he had treated as a constant, the certainty that 9 could not stop 31, had come unfixed, and a sergeant who had survived 2 tours by reading situations honestly made himself look honestly at the woman who had eaten alone at the end of the table with her back to the wall and understood that he had been wrong about her for 6 days, and that he had probably known he was wrong for at least 4 of them and had simply been too busy with the crisis in front of him to follow the thread. People who study terrain the way she had studied terrain, who map exits and measure angles in a room without seeming to, are not quartermaster technicians. He had filed it. Now the file was on a roof a kilometer away, accomplishing more in 9 minutes than his entire defensive plan would manage in 9 hours. Then Anand's voice cut across the room. She had a window. The satellite relay, which had been dropping every 40 minutes, had a gap in the storm, maybe 40 seconds of it. Brant crossed to her in 2 strides and took the handset. And through a wall of static, he heard a voice he knew, the duty officer at Forward Command, a major named Okonkwo, whose call he had been praying for 2 days to receive. He gave his report in the clipped shorthand of a man who knows his seconds are counted. The column was stationary. The Kestrel was holding. He had an asset engaged whose identity he could not confirm and whose effect he could not explain. He asked the only question that mattered. When could they be pulled out? The static surged and ate most of the answer, and what came back through it landed in the room like a stone. The storm system was larger than forecast. The earliest extraction window was not hours. It was 2 days. Hold your position. Out. 2 days. The narrator wants you to feel the weight of that number the way the room felt it, because this is the hinge of the whole night. Private Locke said it out loud before she could stop herself. She can't hold them off for 2 days. She was 19. She was right, in the literal sense. No one could stand on a roof in a blizzard and kill an armored brigade into surrender over 48 hours. The ammunition alone made it impossible, and so did the human body. But Brant, who understood his trade, shook his head slowly and gave the answer that separates people who fight from people who merely shoot. She doesn't have to hold them for 2 days, he said. She has to make the cost of moving forward feel higher than the cost of waiting. That's a different thing. Locke asked what the difference was. Brant looked at the thermal feed, at the scattered shapes that were not advancing. One of them means killing every man down there, he said. The other just means making the ones who give orders afraid to stand up. And on the road, that was precisely what was happening. Hartley did not know about the 2 days yet. She would learn it later, and it would not change what she was already doing, because she had been doing this same arithmetic her whole career, only with smaller numbers and higher stakes. She watched Illick's 4 men struggle up toward the eastern ridgeline through snow to their thighs, and she let them go, because 4 men walking the wrong way for 20 minutes were 4 men subtracted from the column's ability to think, and she did not need to spend a round to remove them. She took a third shot, not at an officer this time, but at the signaler working the secondary encrypted set, the man who was the column's nervous system now that its brain was gone, and when he fell, the cluster of vehicles around the communications carrier lost their coordination in a way that even an untrained eye on a thermal screen could read as panic. Men began moving in 3 directions at once. Some pushed toward the base, some pulled back toward the rear. Some simply stopped and stood facing outward at terrain that held nothing. Weapons raised at the empty eastern wall, and the narrator notes the cruelty of it. Every weapon down there was pointed at a place she was not, and would have stayed pointed there all day. This is the part the story has been moving toward, and it is the part the audience always remembers, so the narrator will slow all the way down for it, because somewhere in the long middle of that engagement, lying on the cold metal of the watershed with her cheek welded to the rifle and her body slowly stiffening with the hours, Sloane Hartley made a decision that had nothing to do with marksmanship. She could have killed more of them. The math allowed it. The targets kept presenting themselves. A different operator would have run the column's casualty count up until it broke. She did not. She killed exactly the men whose deaths removed the column's ability to decide and act, and no others, and she let the rest live and be afraid, because the first task, the one the Army had trained into her, was to make the enemy stop. But the second task, the one no manual had given her, and the only one that had ever truly mattered, was to make certain that the 9 exhausted soldiers in the panel-walled box behind her grew old. That was the whole of it. Not the ridge, not the road, not the brigade, not the report that would climb some chain of command and be filed under an outcome no one could attach to a name. 9 people getting to go home. She had learned the value of that the hardest way a person can learn it, on a different mountain, with a different storm. Holding the hand of a spotter named Reyes, while the extraction that was supposed to come for both of them came for neither. And discovering that all her skill, every shot she had ever made, could not reach across the 2 meters between them and keep the one person she most wanted to keep. She had not been able to bring him home. She had been bringing strangers home ever since, quietly, under names that were not hers, in places that would never have her in their records. It was the only arithmetic she still believed in. Down on the road, Captain Illick did the thing that competent, frightened men eventually do. He stopped trying to advance and started trying to understand. He pulled his head out of the hatch long enough to study the impact geometry of the men who had fallen, the angle their bodies had taken, the timing between the silence and the sound, and somewhere in that study he arrived at the gut-level certainty that whatever was killing his column was not on the ridgeline he had sent 4 men to clear. The angles were wrong. The fire was coming from low and from the side, from inside the defender's own ground, from a position so unlikely that searching for it would cost him the daylight, and the daylight was the only thing keeping his vehicles from sliding off a switchback in a whiteout. He waited. He was not a coward. The narrator will not let him be reduced to one. He simply finished the same equation Brandt had finished an hour earlier from the other side and arrived at the answer Brandt had wanted him to arrive at. That the cost of pushing forward into a threat he could not locate, on a road he could not see, in a storm that could swallow his column, was higher than the cost of pulling back to the valley floor and waiting for the weather to break and for air support that might let him fight an enemy he could find. At a little after noon, Captain Illick gave the order to withdraw. 31 vehicles, minus the men they had left in the snow, began the slow reverse crawl back down the mountain they had been so certain of at dawn. Brandt watched the thermal shapes recede and did not believe it for a full minute. Then Anand, with her head still half inside her headset, said very quietly, "They're pulling back. Sergeant, they're actually pulling back." And the room did not cheer, because they were too tired and too stunned to cheer, and because some of them understood that the morning had cost the men on that road real lives, and a cheer felt obscene. Burdall sat down on an ammunition crate and put his face in his hands. Locke laughed once, a short crack sound that was half a sob. Brandt let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 2 days, and reached for his notebook and wrote down the time because that was the only ceremony he had. The moment that stayed with him longest was not the withdrawal. It came hours later in the slack gray afternoon, while the post ran its quiet maintenance rotations, and the 9 of them moved through the necessary rhythms of a unit that has survived something and is now simply existing until rescue. He walked past the common area, which was nothing more than a folding table and some plastic chairs under a bare bulb, and he saw Sloane Hartley sitting at it. Not at the far end, not with her back to the wall. In the middle, with Locke on one side and Burdall across from her, and Corporal Voss, with his injured ankle propped on a second chair and Anand at the end, and all of them talking, not about the column or the road or the shots, just talking. The way people talk when the thing they have come through has become the ground they are standing on. Brandt stopped in the doorway. Nobody noticed him, and he watched the quiet quartermaster technician who had eaten alone for 6 days laugh at something. Locke said, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, the laugh of a person who has set down a weight she has been carrying so long she had forgotten it could be set down, and is simply present in a warm room with people she has, somehow over 6 days and one terrible morning, come to care about. He turned and went back to the operations room without disturbing it. Some things do not need a sergeant to acknowledge them to be real. The confirmation came that evening, in the last satellite window, before the night storm closed the relay again. Major Okonkwo sent 2 things through the static. The first was an updated extraction window. The break was running longer than hoped, 26 hours now. The second was the answer to a query Brandt had filed that morning, almost on instinct. A cross-reference on the asset he could not identify. And what came back was not a name but a notation, appended by Okonkwo himself in language that broke no rules and named no one, but was as clear as anything Brandt had ever read. It described the operator responsible for the morning's outcome as consistent with a profile that had been inactive, officially, in every record that still existed, for 3 years. It said the operator's last confirmed activity had been a 2-person extraction that had been logged as a failure. It said both operators on that job had been declared missing and presumed dead, and it gave, almost as an afterthought, the only thing the system had ever known her by once the names ran out. A single word, gray line. Brandt sat with that for a long time. He thought about a clean, uninteresting file and a padlocked case stowed under a cot. He thought about a woman who had arrived on the last flight before the storm and spent 6 days being invisible in a building full of people who looked right at her and saw exactly what they expected. He thought about the laugh he had heard in the common area, and about a name that would show up redacted in every search a careful person might run, and about 11 brass casings he had not yet climbed up to confirm, but knew with absolute certainty were waiting in the snow on the roof of the watershed. Then he stood up and went to find her. She was still in the common area, alone now except for Voss, who had fallen half asleep with his foot up in a field blanket over his lap. She was reading something from a small notebook, her own, not an issued one, the kind of book a person keeps for private reasons. Brant sat down across from her and she looked up. He thought about all the things he could say and discarded every one of them, because none was accurate enough for this woman in this moment, and finally he said the only word that was. Gray line. She closed the notebook. She held his eyes. She did not confirm it, and she did not deny it, and she did not look away, and the narrator will tell you, because Brant understood it then, that this was confirmation enough. He nodded once. She nodded once. The understanding passed between them the way the most important understandings always do, not through words or paperwork, but through two people seeing each other clearly and deciding that what they see is worth the weight of knowing it. 26 hours, he said. 26 hours, she answered, and he got up and went back to work, and that was all that was ever said about it. The helicopter came in 26 hours later, through the first clean break in the weather, its rotors cutting the cold air with the specific, unmistakable sound of a rescue arriving on schedule. The 9 of them loaded in sequence, equipment first, then personnel. Voss helped up by Berdal, Locke last off her position as she always was. Brant counted heads at the door the way sergeants count, by name and by face and by the specific human fact of each person he was responsible for. 8, 9. Hartley stepped aboard with the long case in her left hand and took the seat against the rear bulkhead, the one with the clearest line to both exits, an old habit she would never lose, and set the case between her boots and looked straight ahead. The helicopter lifted. Below them the kestrel shrank, and the mountain opened out, and the switchback road that had held 31 armored vehicles 2 mornings ago was already a thin, gray scratch across the white, half erased by new snow, being given back to the valley. In another hour the tracks would be gone. In another day there would be nothing on that road to say that anything had happened there at all, except for the knowledge carried by 9 people rising above the weather, and by one of them who carried it more completely than the rest, and who would carry it in silence to the next post, the next assignment, the next unit that would not know she was coming. Private Cassidy Locke watched her across the cabin. She was thinking about something Berdal had said, that the woman was used to it, used to being invisible, used to carrying the weight by herself, and that this was worse, not better. Then Hartley turned from the window and caught Locke watching, and Locke did not look away. She held the older soldier's gaze, and something passed between them, not the grave understanding that Brant and Hartley had shared, but something younger and more direct, a 19-year-old telling a woman declared dead 3 years ago, without a single word, that she saw her. Not the shot, not the mission, her. Hartley held it for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the window, and the corner of her mouth moved, barely, just enough, and the helicopter flew on through the breaking storm, carrying 9 soldiers away from the mountain and the road, and the empty place where an army had stopped and turned around. Because one quiet woman on a roof had decided that the people everyone else had given up on were worth every calculation and every cold hour and every round fired into the gray. She had not done it to be thanked. Her record, the one that said she was already gone, would say nothing about this morning at all. She had done it because 9 people were alive who should not have been, and because that was the only arithmetic that had ever mattered to her, and because underneath every name she had ever worn and every cold hour she had ever spent, waiting for the wind to give her half a second, that simple sum was the truest thing she knew. The mountains slid away beneath the clouds, and Grayline looked out the window and said nothing, and the silence around her was not the silence of a woman with nothing to say. It was the silence of a woman who had already said everything that mattered, in the only language she had ever truly spoken. 11 times, from a rooftop in a storm, across a distance no one down there had believed was possible until it had already saved them.